There are new developments coming out of Afghanistan every day. Today, I talk one-on-one with someone who served our country in Afghanistan, former 1st Congressional District candidate Tom Perez, for this edition of Quintin's Close-Ups. And if you haven't already, subscribe to my YouTube channel and like Quintin's Close-Ups on Facebook. Tom Perez, welcome back to the award-winning Quintin's Close-Ups.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be on.
Well, I appreciate it greatly. Obviously, I spoke to you, back in 2018 when you were running for the United States Congressional District, that is, obviously the 1st Congressional District. And at the time, you had to suspend your campaign to go back and fight for us in Afghanistan on behalf of the United States. Let me take you to the obvious headlines that are going on right now. NBC News on Tuesday said this: up to 15,000 Americans remain in Afghanistan after a Taliban takeover. United States officials say about 1,100 United States citizens, permanent residents, and their families were evacuated on 13 flights on Tuesday. And then this is from the NPR. Kabul airport attack. 13 United States service members are killed. Where are you emotionally?
Oh man, I have been all over the place. I've put a few things out like on social media, but I've been wanting to talk about this for a while, but I wanted to get my head around it first and my heart around it as well. So we spent some blood, sweat, and tears in Afghanistan is the best way to put it. I've lost a friend there. I spent some time there, and I put some effort into it, as well as, and there's people who've put way more than I have into it. And so to see the effort we put into basically deteriorate in a matter of weeks, less than 2 weeks, was, to put it mildly, disheartening. And then to see the attack this week, we've lost several Marines and a Navy corpsman, and just to see where it is now, just the chaos, and to know that this could have been prevented. And so it just begs the question, why? Like, why didn't we plan for this? The president mentioned that they planned for every contingency. Well, no, you didn't. You didn't plan for this contingency. You didn't plan for, and he said in the same speech that they did not anticipate the Afghan military basically laying down and being rolled over in 2 weeks. Well, which is it, Mr. President? Did you anticipate it and plan for every contingency, or did you not? And so he didn't, obviously, because this was not planned for. No one in the Situation Room, well, if they mentioned this as a possibility, they didn't plan for this. I mean, in my opinion, we shouldn't be here. We should not have closed Bagram Airfield before we had every American out. Bagram was the inject and egress point for all Americans coming in and out of Afghanistan, not Hamid Karzai International Airports. The fact that we're evacuating Americans out of Hamid Karzai tells me there's a problem right there.
Problem right there.
It's a huge problem. And so I'm trying to be as open-minded as I possibly can, but obviously I'm pretty emotionally tied to the situation. And I had friends that were over there that I'm not sure what happened to. I have no idea where they're at. We've lost communications with some of the people that I knew, and these are Americans that were working in country. In terms of like emotionally, I'm just trying to understand how our leadership dropped the ball on this, and I have some theories behind that. We can talk about it if you like, but it's just, I'd like to see some accountability from our leadership, and just at this point, what's done is done, but let's figure out how we can fix it and what to do moving forward. I don't know. Did that answer your question?
Well, yeah, and let me ask you, you talk about the effort. What effort and contingency plan did the Afghan military have?
The Afghan military, they were, to the president's credit, there's several truths out there, right? So, and so many people are focused on one truth or another truth. But and going back to the president's initial speech after Kabul fell, he mentioned his contingency plan that is missing right now. But he also mentioned that the Afghan military had the Taliban's outnumbered about 3-1. I think there's 300,000 of armed, man-trained and equipped Afghan soldiers and pilots to the Taliban's. He said 75,000. The numbers, we're not so sure with it, how many soldiers the Taliban actually have. And so that's true. And the Afghans had a superior military to the Taliban. That's all true as well. And you mentioned that the Afghan military just did not have the will to fight. That's true as well, but it begs the question why. If they had so vastly outclassed the Taliban in terms of the man training and equipping, why did they just walk away in many cases? In most cases, without even firing a shot and getting rolled over. And we're seeing their weapons now in the hands of the Taliban. And in many cases, I'm seeing some of the Taliban soldiers, and you can just see how they're carrying their weapons and how they're conducting themselves as though they were U.S. trained. So that begs the question: have some of the Afghan soldiers turned in, are now fighting with the Taliban?
And let me ask you, Tom, with that training for the Afghan military, what was that like?
So we gave them a lot of the same training that we've given our own soldiers here, in terms of when I was there, we were in the process of trying to train women to actually fly combat missions, and they were turning over a lot of the air support, no, not a lot, but a portion of the air support to the Afghans themselves. They had been flying helicopters. We were outfitting them with helicopters as well as airplanes, so they did have an Air Force. The question about the Air Force, though, was with regards to the support of the Air Force, and a lot of that support was still being done by U.S. contractors. This is in public records, nothing that's classified. And so that was one of the concerns when the U.S. was pulling out, is how that support would continue to maintain. But they still had an Air Force, so nothing like what the U.S. or a Western nation would have, but they still had, which was a vastly superior to what the Taliban had. They had their own special forces. They had trained a special forces regiment of the Afghan military. And there's basically two groups. There was the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces. Under the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, there was the Afghan National Army, the ANA, and then there was the Afghan National Police, ANP. One was under the Ministry of Defense, one was the Ministry of Interior, but they had different roles. But they were strongly trained, not just by U.S., by a lot of our NATO allies as well. There was a lot of NATO nations in countries that were doing incredible training.
And why, with that strong training that they have, why didn't they use the air support?
That's a good question. And that goes back to the initial question that was posed in my head after President Biden's speech, is why. So take the Air Force out of it. We were still 3-1, and we had a stronger, a better trained, better equipped military, just ground forces, taking the Air Force out of it. So why did they lay down? In my opinion, Tom Perez's opinion, it was just a lack of will. To the president's point, why did they have a lack of will? I felt it was a void of leadership in the Afghan military and Afghan government. There was a lot of nepotism and I'll say, what's the word I'm looking for? Corruption at the higher levels of the government. We saw many members of the military, high-ranking generals that would stay in one billet for 10 years, in some cases, 15 years, which is unheard of. In the U.S., you're rotating 3 to 4 years, 5 years at the most, and you're not selecting your replacement. Someone is being selected to replace you, you do a turnover, and you move on to the next billet. In Afghanistan, they would sit there for as long as they wanted. When they were ready to retire, then they would go select their son-in-law, their cousin, or somebody to take their place. And so there's a lot of that going on. And I just felt like there wasn't they didn't care in many cases, especially in the higher levels. And I'll give you an example. The Afghan military, they needed firewood. They used firewood and wood-burning fires to cook their food, to heat themselves. And in northern parts of Afghanistan, it gets very cold. And they had let the firewood contract lapse. This is at the Ministry of Defense. And we would have to dangle money and tell them that we won't give them the next pot of money if they don't get their contract in place. And they're like, okay, fine, we'll do it. And so they just didn't care enough to even get firewood to their own troops that were fighting in the Kandaks. And so what the U.S. provided and NATO provided kind of a glue that kept things together. We had people, advisors and soldiers fighting on the ground alongside the Afghans. And they were referred to as advisors because by 2017, 2018, ISAF and Operation Enduring Freedom, that had sunsetted at the end of 2014. And 2015, Resident Support and Operation Freedom Sentinel stood up, and the idea was to let the Afghans do the heavy lifting in terms of the direct combat missions, and our job was mainly to train and advise, not so much assist. We did have some assistance in there. There was some combat going on with U.S. and NATO, but it's predominantly done by the Afghans. And so they've been doing a lot of the heavy lifting, but with our support. And we kind of kept things running. And I say we, not just the U.S., but also the NATO allies as well. And I think we just pulled out too fast and left a void of leadership. And the higher levels of Afghan government, especially the senior leadership in Afghanistan, just didn't care enough. And there was this disconnect between them and the people fighting on the ground. And the people fighting on the ground didn't have anything to fight for. Then there's cultural issues, which is here in the U.S. There's a lot of parity right now. There's a lot of infighting between Republicans and Democrats, and liberals and socialists versus conservatives and whatnot. And it's all fighting, but we all see ourselves as American. That's something we don't fight about, and we're so passionate. We're fighting so much right now because we care so much about America. We all see ourselves as Americans. We're united. We're at least still at this point united under that. In Afghanistan, many of the people don't see themselves as Afghanistan, and we can't make the mistake of looking at Afghanistan through a Western lens. We have to look at it through an Afghanistan lens. And the factions, we have factions here too. The factions over there are more tribal in nature. You have Pashtuns and Daris and Tajiks and whatnot. And so, in many cases, they didn't see themselves as Afghans. And they didn't have the love of their country enough to fight for it. And my wife said something brilliant the other day, that in order to be willing to fight for something, you have to be willing to die for it. And clearly, the Afghans and the Afghan soldiers weren't willing to die for Afghanistan and what we had built. It just wasn't important enough to them. And that importance and that message had not been communicated from the top levels of leadership on down. And the hope was that we saw a lot of it in the lower levels, and the younger folks were hoping that as they grew up and got more engaged in society and in the leadership, the civilian leadership, but that would start to change. But apparently not.
And speaking of communication and engagement and obviously leadership, what is that communication and engagement like with the Afghan leadership and the United States leadership?
Right now?
Yes, sir.
In terms of what's going on between the former Afghan leadership, because we have to recognize the situation we're in right now. It's between the Taliban. And so there is a lot and this is something that's making a lot of people uneasy, is that there's a lot of communication going on between the Taliban leadership and the U.S. leadership as well. And to the point where there were reports that we were relying on the Taliban to protect our soldiers. Our soldiers were inside the wire, inside Hamid Karzai Airport, and the Taliban was supposed to be providing a buffer of safety because that something like this would happen, this terrorist attack, because they knew that ISIS would come in and disrupt it. And the Taliban did not want that to happen. They want us out as soon as possible, and they didn't want anything that was going to hold us back, like an attack like this, that give us a reason to stay longer in Afghanistan. They want us out. The Taliban wants to be recognized as a major player on the international scene. They've renamed the country the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. They want to be respected, I guess, on the major stage. And so they come in and within a day 11 days, they have a full military with U.S. weapons and aircraft. And the first place they went, they're not stupid, they went to the bank. And they tried to seize the money that we had given to the Afghans. Fortunately, and this is also nothing classified, it's in the news, that the majority of the funds was in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and the rest of it was scattered around various banks in Europe, Switzerland, Germany. And so once the Kabul fell, we were able to seize the money, freeze the funds right away. So they weren't able to get to that. So if the Taliban wants to, they still have to work with us because we hold the purse strings. If they want to use the aircraft that was turned over to them by the Afghan military, they're going to have to work with us because they won't have the ability to maintain the aircraft and or to fly it. So there's a significant trust but verify situation going on, and it doesn't make anybody very easy that we're working with this group of people that carried out an attack on September 11th, these people that we've been fighting for 20 years. But if you think about it, Quintin, this is not without precedent. You know, we have a very good working relationship right now with Germany and Japan. And if you have asked the World War II veterans in the 1950s and 60s, that probably made them very easy as well when we started negotiating and doing trade deals with Germany and Japan in the 50s and 60s, especially in the 70s when Japan became a much stronger player economically, especially with the auto industry and things of that nature. So it's not, well, I say it's not without precedent that we have become allies and trading partners with former enemies and wartime combatants. It's pretty soon right now, and this is a very different enemy. And that the Taliban isn't really a nation. They're not really a voting group of people. They are more of an idealistic Islamic terrorist group. And so to trust them enough to have a line of communication with them and start, quote unquote, working with them. Right now, we're more or less forced to. If we're going to be able to get our people out as well as our Afghan partners out, we're going to have to either work with the Taliban or face them on the battlefield. That's effectively where we're at.
What do you fear that they might want more from the United States?
Taliban? I would say that they probably want money at this point. They want to be in recognition. This is my opinion. That, as I mentioned, they want to be recognized as an international player. Afghanistan right now is arguably one of, at least especially military sense, one of the strongest nations in that part of the world and in the CENTCOM AOR. And so they want to take that and move it forward. And I think they want to move on from just being a terrorist caliphate to being a recognized major player on the national scene. And they're going to need money to do that. And money can either come through trade or it can come through release of the funds that we had given to Afghanistan. And so you can see that in the rhetoric and what they're talking about in their press statements and whatnot about talking about respecting women's rights. But they always end that statement with within the confines of Islam. But so that leaves the door open to, okay, what exactly do you mean? And one of the challenges we're working with the Taliban is they don't have the organization of, like, for example, the United States, where we have Uniform Code of Military Justice, and we have our own set of laws, and if someone breaks them, and they have to answer to them. It doesn't mean that people don't break laws, but we have a system set up that you can, while you may not be able to trust and or depend on a singular person, you can trust and depend on the system. And our set of laws and our system of government. With the Taliban, that doesn't exist. And the Taliban leadership might be saying one thing in their press conferences while their soldiers are doing something completely different out on the ground in terms of beating people. And we've heard reports of putting a comedian to death recently and things of that nature. So there's a long way to go to establish those lines of communication.
Speaking of communication, do you believe the former president and his administration that is made a mistake?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that goes without question. I can't think of anyone, and they made a lot of mistakes. It wasn't just one. And so, as I mentioned earlier, one of the major mistakes was to pull our people out, or to end the mission and pull out combat troops before we removed all Americans and the partners, and having that contingency plan and what would happen if the Afghan military just decided not to fight. Those are, I think, three mistakes I listed right there. Are you asking, did they make a mistake by leaving Afghanistan? No, I don't think that was a mistake. I think the mistakes, plural, that were made were how they did it, and the mistake upon mistake of how it was carried out in such haste, with poor planning, with leaving people in country, and with no defense forces, or very limited defense forces, relying on the Afghan military to provide security for our people, and then not having a contingency plan of what if things went south, i.e., leaving another way to get out of there. Go ahead. You have a question? Follow-up question for that?
Oh yeah. Well, when you think of Afghanistan, Tom, how do you look at the perimeter of obviously Kabul and Bagram?
I'm sorry. Can you ask me that one more time?
Yeah, when you think of Afghanistan, it is. How do you look at the perimeter around obviously Kabul and Bagram?
So, I mean, when I was there, Kabul was relatively safer than Bagram was. I remember that the last night I was there, Bagram would regularly, or at least more regularly than we would, get we call IDF, indirect fire. So in neither place could the Taliban or HQ or anybody get close enough really to have a direct engagement. So they would just launch the mortars or fire a rocket or something like that. We didn't never see that in Kabul because we had a green zone around us. Our camp was inside the green zone, and it buttressed up against the wall, outer wall of the green zone. And then the U.S. Embassy was right next to us, so I could actually walk over to the U.S. Embassy from the camp, the resident support headquarters camp. And then there was, I think, the Afghan intelligence building right outside, and so we would get a lot of suicide attacks. I say a lot. There was, I guess that's a relative term. One could be a lot if it's a bad day, but and so we would get a lot of what we call VBIDs, vehicle-borne IEDs, or PBIDs, personnel-borne, someone wearing a suicide vest. So we would see that more often than anything else. But now it looks like that's kind of swapped. We're seeing Kabul obviously being the center of influence, and that's what the Taliban had their hopes on. They were marching toward Kabul. I haven't heard of really what's going on in Bagram. It was turned over to the Afghan military several months ago. I want to say it was back in June. It was turned over, but there's not really a whole lot there. Really, that the Taliban would really concern themselves over. We didn't leave any aircraft there. There was a bunch of trucks and jeeps left there, so there's some vehicles that they could use. There's some buildings. There's a hospital that was fully furnished that we left behind for them to use. But it's mainly just a bunch of buildings. There's an airfield there, but the Taliban doesn't have much of an air force, so they can't really use it that much. So their sights were set on Kabul, and there's a whole lot of just empty farmland between Kabul and Bagram, so there's not a whole lot there. But it would be interesting to see what goes on. But I mean, right now, the Taliban pretty much controls the entire country. Outside of some certain areas that are more in ISIS control, but it's really their country.
And what exactly is the Afghan soldiers' relationship with the Afghan people, and what is the United States soldiers' relationship with the Afghan people?
So the majority of the Afghan people, the ones that I interacted with and that I saw when I was in Afghanistan, loved that we were there. I mean, a lot of it was that we were spending a lot of money there, and so we're helping to keep their economy going. But we had great relationships with the Afghans that I knew when I was in Afghanistan, and we can see just from the news reports that they want help from the U.S. to the point where they're just handing their babies over to U.S. forces. Just take my baby and get them out of here. And that's shows right there that they would trust a soldier, American soldier who they never met, don't know, with their child, versus keeping them in Afghanistan and the threats that they have with the Taliban. The Afghan military has been dispersed, as far as I can tell, is nowhere to be seen. I'm not sure what has happened to them. As I mentioned, you could see in many of the Taliban soldiers in the picture that I've seen, the way that they're carrying their weapons. There's a specific way where we're taught to carry a weapon, and they're carrying it like that. Now, either they're mimicking us to, again, give that persona of being a legitimate force, being a legitimate military, being legitimate, adding some type of legitimacy to their movement, to their government, or they're, in many cases, Afghan military who joined up with the Taliban. It's probably a little bit of both, to be perfectly honest with you. Or maybe some of the Afghan military that's joined with the Taliban are teaching their fellow Taliban soldiers how to carry a weapon the U.S. way. And so that's a very interesting question. And I'm looking to see what's going to happen to the Afghan military. What we are seeing that something that is promising is not necessarily the Afghan military, but the people. This goes to your earlier question about the Afghans' relationship with the U.S. I think 20 years of freedom has rubbed off on a lot of the Afghan people there. We're seeing protests and the Afghan people stepping up and saying, wait a second, they understand things like John Locke principles of the government rules by consent of the governed and the social contract and things like that, where they're protesting against, say, wait a second, we don't necessarily want to be ruled by you, and we want to have elections. And I think 2 weeks ago we saw a protest where they tore down the Taliban flag and put up the Afghan national flag. There was in their first press conference, the Taliban was trying to play nice and saying we're going to respect women's rights and we're going to offer amnesty to any of the Afghans who work with the U.S. military. And he said, the speaker said, we will forgive you. And a reporter, a journalist, spoke up, an Afghan journalist said, but will we forgive you for all that you've done to us? So think about that as a journalist yourself, stepping up and having that and recognizing freedom of the press and freedom of speech to be able to speak out against them and call them out. I don't know if that would have been done 20 years ago. So one of the emotions, I guess, that from your first question about my emotions is a bit of hope that we haven't seen the last of the Afghan people and we haven't seen the last of Afghanistan, and to see what Afghanistan turns into when they recognize that, wait a second, you guys being the Taliban leadership, you guys work for us. If you want to run our country, we have to let you do that. And so we'll see what comes of that.
And what contingency plan should the United States have in place to actually secure the airport at Kabul?
That's a very good question. I'm sure those discussions are being had right now. And they did not have a contingency plan, clearly, and they were going off the reactionary. And as I mentioned in the beginning, I'm a financial planner, and I often joke with some of my clients who come to me when they have a problem after they've had the problem, and I tell them, like, I'm a financial planner, not a financial reactor, right? And I don't want to react to something. Let's plan for it. And so this wasn't planned for, and they're reacting at this point. So the contingency, hopefully they had a contingency plan in place for if ISIS got involved, and that's what's happened now. What I would think is they're going to probably send in additional security forces and not rely on the Taliban to secure the perimeter. I would hope that they're going to add a certain buffer of security around the airport, not just within the airport itself, and try to streamline the process of getting people into the airport and out on the airplanes and the evacuations, especially, and even with, the vetting process. And I don't want to, we don't know if everyone who's been evacuated, I guess, was quote unquote authorized to be evacuated. We were sending out these certificates of authenticity to get people on the airplanes. Many of them were photocopied and handed out. And so there may have been somebody who had a legitimate reason, who was an interpreter or worked with the U.S. and had a legitimate reason to get evacuated, but then maybe he gave it to his brother, his cousin, or his friend or somebody who just didn't want to live under the Taliban rule and wanted to get out. So not saying that we shouldn't harbor the refugees and help the Afghan people as much as we possibly can, but there's still needs to be, I'd like to see more of a process and more of the U.S. taking ownership. Okay, this is something that Lieutenant Colonel Chanel put out yesterday was, okay, raise your hand, yes, we screwed up, we messed this up, but this is how we're going to fix it, and get in there and just take charge again. Have the U.S., okay, this is not working out, we screwed up, let's take charge. Let's take charge of the airport. Let's take charge of this portion of Kabul. Let's take charge of getting people through the vetting process, getting them on the airplanes and getting them out, and not relying so much on the Taliban. And there was this kind of a line of demarcation between to get into the airport where it was just kind of a glom of people, and people were trying to get through the Taliban barricades, and then once they got into the airport, then they had to get through the U.S., and it would take them sometimes days to get there. These are U.S. citizens just took days to get into the airport. And it made for an easy, soft target for a suicide bomber. Short answer, I think what will happen, and I hope what will happen, is the U.S. will take more ownership of the process, the vetting, and to the security perimeter, and increase the number of security forces in there to add more security around the airport, with different layers and buffer of security around the airport.
Tom Perez, thank you so much for your time. And again, welcome back to Quintin's Concepts.
Thank you so much. It was, as always, my pleasure.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.